So now we're going on to Stephen Abrahamson. He is the Senior Director of Product Security at GE Healthcare. Steve leads the GE Healthcare Product Cybersecurity Organization in the development and implementation of the GE Healthcare design, engineering, privacy, and security process across all the global product lines, as well as the development of security systems and tools, integration of security with strategic software programs, and the development of collaborative approaches with customers, regulators, and industry groups. Steve's also a frequent speaker, such as at the FDA, at the Department of Health and Human Services, at NIST, at HIMSS, at SANS, and many other events. So Steve, I'm really looking forward to your talk. Please go ahead and take it away.
All right, well, thanks very much, Rebecca. And let me know, John or Rebecca, if you have any difficulty hearing me. So thanks very much for the introduction. As Rebecca mentioned, this is Steve Abrahamson. I'm Senior Director for Product Cybersecurity at GE Healthcare, and I work up in Wisconsin, where it's very hot right now. It's not going to last very long, though. And I want to thank Mitch for that great presentation. I agree with everything that Mitch said, and I think what we can talk about now is how can a medical device manufacturer support a lot of the great things that Mitch and other security people at health delivery organizations are trying to do. You know, what can we do from the perspective of the manufacturer? And definitely medical device manufacturers are in the crosshairs. Lots of focus the last couple of years. So if we go around this chart counterclockwise, many of us know that in the last couple of years, FDA has released a couple of guidance documents on cybersecurity. They started with a guidance document on pre-market submissions and how we address security risk management within our pre-market submissions. They more recently released a guidance document on cybersecurity post-market, that is for devices that are already out in the field being used at health delivery organizations. We've received a letter. That is, the major manufacturers have received a letter from a United States senator expressing concerns over vulnerabilities in medical devices and if those are posing patient safety risks. We have seen recalls associated with cybersecurity vulnerabilities in medical devices. And a little bit different than the patient safety look, we can also see many fines associated with HIPAA violations. So we know that we have customers out there that are paying fines associated with data breaches that may or may not be associated with medical devices, but at any rate, it gives a lot of attention to the need to protect patient data. And I'm just going to show a couple of articles that I think demonstrate the progression of the way that we look at risk within medical devices and healthcare. And if we start thinking about patient safety, the first thing that I know we were talking about a few years ago was hackers, you know, the evil hackers that might hack into a device and kill somebody or cause patient harm. We started seeing researchers talk about that, demonstrating that you could hack into devices. And I like the headline here, medical hacking poses a terrifying threat in theory. So we actually have not seen that happen in real life, where a hacker says, hey, I'm going to try to hurt somebody, I'm going to hack into a device and cause it to fail. But theoretically, it could happen. We have seen it happen on TV. If it happens on TV, I suppose it could happen in real life, of course. Then the other area of focus was on theft of medical data. And we can see that there's a huge market in medical data, mainly for the purposes of insurance fraud. And we've seen a great increase in theft of medical data over the last few years. And kind of ironically, you'll often hear the statistic that medical data on the dark market is anywhere from 10 to 50 times as valuable as just pure financial data, because it can be used for health insurance fraud. There's such a prevalence of stolen health data on the market. We've actually seen the price of stolen healthcare data start to come down. So it's a supply and demand thing. I'm not sure that's necessarily good news, but we've seen the cost of stolen data start to come down out there. And then more recently, the first time we saw this was in February 2016, the growth of ransomware. So a hospital out in Hollywood was the first known case where ransomware hit a health delivery organization. Since then, if you're not aware, there was a massive ransomware attack just last May, so that was the WannaCry. I think everybody's probably familiar with that. So it started as what seemed to be a very limited cases of ransomware attacks. If that didn't get your attention, I think the WannaCry attack did get everybody's attention, and that certainly put a lot more focus on cybersecurity. So we've seen the focus on risk really progress from the initial patient safety, working its way to data privacy, and then actual availability of medical devices that could be affected by such things as ransomware. We have seen also the evolution of nation-state cyber threats. Is this really relative to healthcare cybersecurity? And for those of you that aren't aware that it is, I hope to briefly just demonstrate that it is. So we started seeing nation-state involvement in cyber warfare way back in '93, maybe it goes back before then, but government attacks going back as far as '93. Most significantly, the first known theft of medical data by the Chinese military was in 2013. So Chinese military has at least 9 cyber warfare divisions. They are actively focused on stealing healthcare data. Why is that? We can speculate. And then more recently, of course, WannaCry hitting in 2017. I mentioned a few minutes ago, first ransomware attacks in 2016. So WannaCry, is that attributable to North Korea? You know, what is that associated with the nation state? There's some evidence that perhaps that was associated with North Korea. So nation state level threats certainly are relevant to healthcare. So when we look back at the last couple of slides, as I mentioned, when we deal with healthcare cybersecurity, and I think Mitch brought this out really well, that we have to consider various risk domains. We have to consider patient safety. That's our primary mission here. And we have lots of regulations. As a medical device manufacturer, we are regulated in the US by FDA, similar agencies in other countries. And those regulations are focused on patient safety. But it's a little bit different focus. It's patient safety within intended uses. And now we're talking about malicious uses, or what you might call intentional misuse of medical devices. And we also have to be concerned with privacy. And that is protecting the confidentiality of patient data. And as a medical device manufacturer, we know that our customers in the US have to comply with HIPAA laws. And if you read the HIPAA law, it doesn't provide specific requirements for medical devices, but as a device manufacturer, we have to enable our customers to be able to comply with HIPAA. And then if we consider security overall, protecting confidentiality, integrity, and availability, we know that there's a strong overlap between security and safety and security and privacy, and we have to be able to protect medical devices and the patients that use those medical devices across all these different risk domains when we approach cybersecurity for medical devices. So let's go back a little bit to a little bit more academic look at security. So this is what I call healthcare security risk part 1. So we always think of security as risk management, and what we really want to do as a medical device manufacturer is make sure that what we are doing ultimately is aligned with the risk management practices followed by customers, as Mitch described a little bit earlier. And when we think of risk, if you like math, risk is really a function of the asset, the threats, the vulnerabilities, and you can reduce risk by applying controls. And I'm going to talk about how we use that concept in the way that we look at security within medical devices. When we talk about an asset, that's the data or the device itself. Talk about threats, those are malicious actions or malware, which is created by malicious threat actors out there. Vulnerabilities could be weaknesses in the design, and controls are things that we can do within the device or within an operation to protect it from security risks. Things like access controls, authentication, and so on. And if we think of modeling risk, there's a simple diagram on the bottom of this slide. We can think of a bad consequence at the bottom would be perhaps a threat actor accessing patient records inappropriately. The trigger could be the threat actor has malicious intent. So you have to start with somebody that has malicious intent here. The event would be that that actor gains network access to the device, and then the consequence is access to those patient records. We can apply control to minimize the likelihood that that actor is going to be able to gain access to the device by, as an example, putting in place some access controls. We can also mitigate the impact of that consequence if it were to occur by limiting the amount of data stored on the device. So when we're designing a device, we want to look both at access controls that can help minimize the likelihood that a bad event will occur, and we also want to look at mitigations that if something bad does occur, that we have minimized the impact. Now, let's look at part two. We often think of risk in terms of likelihood and impact, and that's the common way that anybody doing any kind of risk assessment would look at risk. We also just talked about how risk in terms of security is a function of the asset, the threats, the vulnerabilities, and the controls. When we marry those two together, we can think of the likelihood in security terms as a function of what is the threat actor's motivation, what is the threat actor's capability, and how easy is it to exploit a given vulnerability in a device. And again, we can reduce the likelihood by applying controls. And then if we think of the impact in that risk function, we can also think of impact in terms of the threat actor motivation, the asset value, and the type of harm that might be caused by a security event. And the harm could be related to literally patient harm. It could also be organizational harm, impact operations, those types of things. And we can reduce the impact by applying mitigants, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. And we have to think about the motivation of threat actors. What is motivating them? With cyber criminals, it's mainly money. They're going to do things that they can monetize. Nation states are looking for some type of political economic advantage. Hacktivists are trying to promote a cause. And then you have your general malicious actors that just want to do bad things for whatever reason. Whenever you see this, in many contexts, you'll see somebody talk about the malicious insider. And I would say that a malicious insider is one of these other things. But the key thing to worry about is cyber criminals are doing things that they can monetize. And I think the ransomware attacks makes that very obvious for people that didn't quite think about that before. So now, remember the function where when we're looking at managing risks within medical devices, we're considering that risk is a function of the asset, the threats, the vulnerabilities, and we're going to reduce that by controls. So when we do this applied to a medical device, what kinds of things do we think about when we look at the asset? Well, some of the high-level things we think about in terms of confidentiality: does the device contain PHI? And I'll use the U.S. Legal terminology here. Does it have PHI? What's the amount of PHI? What is the type of PHI? Are there direct identifiers, perhaps indirect identifiers? And whose PHI is it? So what are some of the risks associated with confidentiality on that device? Integrity factors. Is a given device critical to patient care? If it has a malfunction, is that going to put a patient at immediate safety risk? So we can consider the impact associated with some integrity factors. And how about availability factors? So that's somewhat related, but here, does the device have to be up and running 99.999% of the time without creating some kind of a patient safety risk? So is it critical to ongoing patient care, or is it critical to some type of business activity? Is it something where there's a very high dependence on, say, revenue if something is used in a smaller clinic? So how important is availability of a given device? And then we also have to consider data flows and consider the content of data flows, the technology used for data flows. For example, is it wireless? Rebecca talked earlier about just checking Wi-Fi. You know, if you're sending data over a wireless connection, there's risks associated with that. And looking at if data flows are crossing organizational or in some cases, national boundaries. So all those things have to be considered when looking at the asset. Now let's consider the threats. We talked about this a little bit before. Basically, we want to think about threat actor motivation relative to the asset, threat actor capabilities, and observed incidents. So as an example, we now know for sure that healthcare networks are susceptible to ransomware attacks, and threat actors are motivated to commit such attacks because that's something that they believe they can monetize. And looking at vulnerabilities, so the next part of the function is vulnerabilities. How do we minimize vulnerabilities within a medical device? Well, we have to do things such as follow secure coding practices. Usually if you have a bug in your software code, it may have some performance impact, but a bug oftentimes is something that some threat actor out there can figure out how to exploit for security purposes. We also have to consider the software used in the device. What's the software bill of material? Are we using internal software, third-party software? What's going to be our ability to support it over a long-term basis? Mitch talked about how we used to put a device out in the field and just assume it's going to run well for 15, 20 years. But how do we support the software over that time period? We're going to have to consider how we're going to support it, patch it, et cetera. The third item there, what kind of assurance testing do we do? Make sure that we do such things as basic vulnerability scanning, various forms of dynamic application testing, and ultimately, in some cases, penetration testing at some level. And do we remediate the findings that are identified through that various levels of assurance testing? And then also with the life cycle plan, just as I mentioned a moment ago, do we have a plan for supporting the device over its life cycle via patches, software updates, and what's the expected time frame where we're going to be able to effectively support security of that device? And then finally, we can reduce risk through controls. So security controls actually implemented within the device, the effectiveness of the implementation, and have we applied all the correct policies, and have we made certain features configurable based on the way that customers want to use them. So we have to consider controls out of a standard controls catalog, and also customer or internal policies, making sure that we're consistent with what customers are looking for. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. All right, so that's conceptually how we consider medical device security. And let's drill in just a little bit more in the time we have remaining, how we actually apply that within the healthcare ecosystem. As I mentioned earlier, our main goal is to make sure that what we're doing on the manufacturing side as a medical device manufacturer is aligned with risk management practices employed by our customers. First of all, we want to consider principles of healthcare cybersecurity, given the various types of risks that we have. And the first principle I propose to you is risk-based controls to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of healthcare assets from malicious actors. And I say risk-based because not all medical devices are the same. They don't have the same risks. We just went through in the last couple of slides how we can consider risks relative to different devices and make sure that we have the right control set applied given the risks of a given device. We have to respect patient privacy. We want to, and the way that we apply that is we want to minimize collection of identifiers unless they have a explicit legitimate purpose within the function of that device. And also, to the extent that it's practical in a given device, give patients the ability to control use of their data. And then also, very important is transparency. We want to be very transparent with users of our devices on what the security capabilities of our devices are, what residual risks they have, and how those might be managed in the user environment. And a very important element, and again, Mitch brought this up very well, is collaboration. You cannot create a secure environment just on the side of the manufacturer. It has to be a collaboration between the manufacturers, the healthcare providers, and also other technology vendors that are supporting that space. So how do we build a control set? I mentioned one of the important concepts is risk-based security controls. How do we build that up? The process that I've proposed to you, and at GE, by the way, to fully train our engineering staffs on this process is about a 2-day process. So I'm going to give you about a 3-minute version of it, and I'm getting down to the last few minutes of the presentation. So we want to make sure when we're developing a device that we understand what are the inherent risk factors in that device, and I went through the process that we used to do that in the last couple of minutes. We also want to make sure that we're looking specifically at privacy risks and doing a privacy impact assessment. So we want to have very clear understanding of what identifiers are collected by the device, whether they're direct or indirect identifiers. We also want to make sure that we are minimizing use of identifiers to only where we have a legitimate purpose for it. And then we also want to do a final security risk assessment where we're looking at various types of malicious activities that may cause security failure modes, and making sure that we have adequate safeguards against those remaining security failure modes. And that's going to give us, going through that set of steps is going to give us 2 different things. One is a set of risk-based security controls to include within a specification. And the other thing it's going to give us is transparency to our residual risks, which we can provide via documentation and risk management collaboration with our customers. And I did get a really good question here. Where do these controls come from? Well, I would strongly recommend security controls come from a well-accepted catalog of security controls. And at GE Healthcare, we have what we call the GE Healthcare Security Controls Catalog, but is built predominantly on NIST 800-53. So we find that the NIST Security Controls Catalog, which is 800-53, is the best standard to use, and it's relatively easily mapped to virtually any security framework or security structure. But we've also added to it GE Healthcare defined controls, which are more specific to our medical devices. So our internal catalog is about 80% NIST, and we've added in a few of our own controls. So that was a great question. We always want to keep in mind that when we look across risk, risk is starting with, looking at residual risk. That is the inherent risk, which is based on the device function and the way that it's used, and you subtract out the risk that you've remediated. That's your residual risk. And then we just talked about this a little bit, but risk-based security controls, we often think of controls as sort of a flat list, a 2-dimensional list of security controls. It's really 3-dimensional. When we look at the device and the design elements within it, we have to consider how those controls map to data flows, data stores, processing, and interacting. So essentially, you end up with a 3-dimensional list of security controls where you know what controls have to be applied at each data flow, and our devices could have as many as between 10 and 20 different data flows, data storage, et cetera. So you have to map controls across all those different design elements. And Rebecca was talking earlier about you might perhaps have access controls or authentication for somebody logging into a device, but if you have a wireless connection and you don't have any protections on the wireless connection, you have overlooked that data flow. So we have to make sure that we're looking at all those data flows. And what are some of the trends we see? This is a short list. You could probably spend an hour on any one of these things, but one of the key things that we see as very important is collaboration. That's manufacturers, health systems, regulators. And we do see a very collaborative environment in the healthcare ecosystem right now. We also see, in some cases, an IT compliance approach, but it's transitioning more to risk management. So sometimes you start with compliance, but you have to put it in the context of risk management, and your compliance should be aligned with and helping your risk management. And what I would say is if you're doing your risk management properly, the compliance is easy, and maybe it's a little bit of paperwork, but the compliance should be actually smaller, a subset of the overall risk management actions. And then there's a drive for transparency and vulnerabilities and risks. So we have to be able to share information on that with people that actually use the device. And I would say that the extent to which we're transparent actually helps our customers reduce their risks. and also common approaches for risk management. We're seeing, I would say, a proliferation of approaches for risk management, and we have to start to bring that together in a collaborative environment and base our risk assessments on a common set of principles. And also overcoming barriers to lifecycle support. That's something that we really have to focus on, particularly in cases where we're using software that may not have the same life cycle as the useful life cycle of the device. And then there's some advanced controls that we see customers asking for and that we're integrating into more devices. Things like encryption, multi-factor authentication, code integrity checks that are built into the device, whitelisting to limit execution to only those programs authorized to execute, integrated security analytics with the devices, and also distributed ledger, or otherwise known as blockchain, is starting to get some talk in the medical device world. And then really, how do we close the loop? And I think Rebecca brought up a good point earlier in the introduction. She asked the doctor about how secure are the devices. And the challenge that we have within the manufacturing world is that our businesses are very lined up with asking doctors and clinicians for the user requirements. So we come up with devices that do wonderful things, great images, they work faster, they are better at helping with diagnosis. But we have to make sure that we're also covering the user needs of the security people at our customers. And that's something that has been a challenge for us. So this is not really so much a technical problem. It is a business problem, and Mitch brought that out very much in his earlier presentation. We have to stop looking at security only as a technical problem, as a business problem and a product management challenge. So we have to make sure that we're supporting identifying the user needs related to security, making sure those get baked into our designs, making sure that we implement those requirements appropriately through secure development engineering practices, and then we're providing secure products to our customers. And I'm going to wrap it up right there. I've got my email on the slide, and if there are any final questions, I can answer those.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Steve. That's a lot of really great information. I do have a few questions, so we have 2 minutes left in your time. I have someone asking about what you're doing to make your devices compliant with the EU General Data Protection Regulation, or the GDPR. And they had an additional question to that. You know, what are you doing to make them GDPR compliant, and how are you going to address those devices that are already out there that are not GDPR compliant? And I know that's a big question, but maybe you can give us just a brief summary of what, if anything, you're doing.
Yeah, that's a good discussion. I have the same discussion with our internal privacy legal people, but the short answer is that when we define our design engineering process, so I mentioned that we go through a specific risk assessment process that pulls in risk-based security controls. We want to make sure that we're also applying certain policies within that, and we extract policies from regulations like GDPR or other national frameworks that we believe will meet our internal requirements, but also enable customers to meet their requirements. For example, capabilities to limit storage of data, delete data, minimize identifiers, those types of things. So without getting into too much detail, we bake those requirements into our process so that it's really transparent to the engineering teams, because we can't expect engineering teams to understand the nuances of GDPR. As far as existing devices that customers may have, I'm not sure the answer to that one. I think that's something that we have to be transparent on the features and capabilities of those devices and work with our customers to help manage their risks and compliance requirements regarding that.
Okay, great. Well, and it'll probably be a good idea to keep an eye on your website, and if they have other types of devices, keep their eyes on those vendors' websites as well for that information, I anticipate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Steve. I sure appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.